what we wanted to do today is just kind of have a dialogue and kind of start out with some origin stories, talk about the point and purpose of science fiction, speculative fiction, especially in the times in which we find ourselves. We've got a really kind of unprecedented confluence of events happening now. We've got a global pandemic, likely a global recession. We have social protest movements that are gaining traction in ways that they have struggled to gain traction before, and they're really finding some traction now with Black Lives Matter and organization against social police brutality and police killings. So there's a lot happening in our society. And science fiction is a really important space where these sorts of issues have always been kind of central to thinking through our current situations and circumstances and politics, everything. So Betsy and I are particularly excited to kind of talk about and riff a little bit and hear from you all about how science fiction is kind of informing the way that you're coping and engaging with and thinking about what's going on in the world right now. Because for us, these are truly like science fiction they provide spaces for radical imagination, radical imagining. So that's by way of introduction. Betsy, if you have any thoughts that you want to share before we give our origin stories.
That was a lovely preamble. So Professor Jones, I hand things back to you to see if you could start us off with your origin. By the way, we are really looking forward to hearing from everybody here, anyone who would like to participate in this conversation, to hear everybody's origin stories, or if it's not an origin story per se, but all of our entries into discovering really the kind of really great, important cultural and political work that this body of literature can and does do, right? So back to you, Professor Jones.
Yeah, for sure. So race is kind of a central concern for both Betsy and myself. When you think of science fiction, when you think of science fiction scholars, or when many people think of it in kind of the popular context, they don't think of people of color. They don't think of women of color. It's considered like a 12-year-old adolescent boys thing, right? And so for me, that's the perception of it. For me, I entered into a love of science fiction just by simply being an avid reader growing up. My parents were both educators. My father was a music instructor for some years and then was an English instructor for the majority of his teaching career from middle school. And I was a lit geek. He taught English. There are a lot of books always around to read. And then when I exhausted the books in our house, I lived a couple of blocks away from the library. I lived in the library. So, one of the things is that I just read everything. And science fiction was a part of that. Mythology was a big part of that. All genres, I didn't care. I just loved to read. And so when I was in middle school, I read Dune, and it kind of blew my mind and rocked my world. And I was hungry for more. And I read Michael Crichton, and I read all sorts of other kind of classic. I would look at the list on the wall, because in the library, you remember in school and at the library that they have this list of top 100 books, right, that you should read. And sometimes science fiction texts were on there and sometimes they weren't. But I entered into it just by being an avid reader, just point blank, and just reading anything that I could get my hands on. And I didn't know that it was supposed to be a genre written by white men for white boys. I just loved good storytelling, right? And at the end of the day, that's kind of what anybody is looking for, is a quality story, quality narrative, quality character development and emplotment. And the genre, for me at that time, was really irrelevant. And that's how I got into science fiction, because I loved reading, period. And all I cared about was the well-told tale. So, Betsy.
All right. Well, that was lovely. You always learn more about people when you hear their origin stories about, how they got into what it is that they do for a living, in other words. For me, it's really two things that are interrelated. One is my basically love and curiosity for and about fantasy worlds, different worlds, and just difference in general, right? I'm an immigrant to this country, and when I got here at the age of 10, it was very science fiction-y in the sense that I got dropped on a different planet. I didn't speak the language. I have to figure out what the codes and customs are here. It is very much quite literally and you know, figuratively like an alien being dropped on a planet and trying to figure your way through this different planet, right? So being an immigrant has always been very science fiction-y for me, in other words. I loved reading about different worlds because when I was still in Taiwan before my family immigrated here, I was reading the so-called world classics. So, you know, even from the age of 8 and 9, I started to read Dickens, Hugo, a lot of the Bible translated into a young adult Chinese, because that the Bible felt very science fiction-y to me at the time. And so, you know, coming from a very sort of immigrant background, science fiction and the immigrant narrative intersected for me in that kind of interesting way. Now, the other love of mine is, quite frankly, spaceships. I love spaceships. So when I immigrated to the States, it was 1976. The next year, Star Wars came out. I watched Star Wars, I think, I don't know how many times, because, you know, the story itself is familiar. It's this very familiar hero cycle and things like that. But the spaceships, it was new. I couldn't get over it. That's where I wanted to be. And I love space. I love the silence of space. I wanted to be out in space. Sometimes when I get annoyed and frustrated with humankind, I wanted to go out to space and leave this planet well enough alone. I'm sure that many of us have felt that way in the last couple of months, if not the last couple of years since somebody entered the White House. So in any case, the love of spaceships and space, that's the technology side of things. So when I first started reading, it was a blend of fantasy and science fiction. So the earliest fantasy books I read were actually something like, I remember this very well, Anne McCaffrey's. This is when I started to learn English. So I actually didn't read a lot of science fiction in English until I was about 13 or 14. And I started to read Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders of Pern. I love the dragons. I couldn't get over the dragons. And dragons are kind of like spaceships. You know, you develop this kind of weird relationship with them. Certainly Tolkien's Lord of the Rings stuff. It was a weird series called the Xanth series by Piers Anthony. Really cringe-worthily misogynistic and all kinds of stuff. But, you know, at that age, you read through that stuff and you didn't quite know what it was that until much later. And then, of course, a lot of Le Guin stuff. The Dispossessed. I remember a friend of mine found this copy of The Dispossessed in the high school library. Remember that I liked science fiction and gave it to me. I read The Dispossessed, and that was my first discovery of how political science fiction can be, and that I learned a lot of politics from science fiction. I learned about the machinations of political, you know, operations and machineries by reading science fiction. And I also read Dune, same thing, very, very political. Down the road, started to dip into writers of color. When I got to Octavia Butler, that, you know, everything about that, everything that she wrote was mind-blowing. And of course, much of my scholarship is on Asian American science fiction writers, as many of you know. So that's how I got into it. And really, in a nutshell, with the spaceship, I'll say one more thing. When I entered college, I entered college as a first year majoring in aerospace engineering because I wanted to work on the space shuttle. For various reasons, I switched over to literature, and I'm very happy there. But partly it was actually the fact that I discovered that I'd rather read about spaceships than actually design them and build them. Too much math, and I couldn't take it. So.
Thanks for that origin story, Betsy. I I love that you switched from being an aeronautical engineer to an English major. Although I'm sure you would have made a great astronaut as well. But yeah, so yeah, to your point, Betsy, you know, when you're a kid and you're reading these things, you're reading them for, you know, other reasons than perhaps the political and politicized nature that's kind of there, that's there. And I myself did not actually even know that I was going to study science fiction as a scholar until I'm well into graduate school and I've got to figure out what I'm going to do my dissertation on. I knew it was going to be in the field of African American literature. I'd actually originally planned to do folklore and discovered I hate folklore theory and despise that. And so I was like, you know what? Didn't actually love doing field work either, or qualitative methods, nor quantitative. All of that was just like too sciencey for me, ironically, or perhaps not. So, you know, in conversations with my advisor, discovered that actually in African American literature, there's a very strong realist tradition, and scholars of African American literature were actually going out of their way to dismiss African American science fiction. And that to me was fascinating and presented an opportunity to kind of start to delve into that literature and kind of change the narrative about what Black people should be writing about, what constitutes political race literature versus, you know, apolitical race literature. It's in the 60s and 70s in particular, is what business do you have writing about aliens and whatnot when we've got real issues going on in terms of, again, back then still, police brutality and injustice and equality. What is the point of science fiction for Black people, right, who are in the struggle? And for me, having grown up reading science fiction and becoming a more critical thinker, obviously in college and graduate school, I actually felt like there was a lot that science fiction was doing, and by Black writers in particular, that was very political. It just comes at it sideways. And for me, that's actually much more effective than being very kind of pedantic and on the nose with, you know, being preachy about how we should think about political issues, social justice issues. So when I started reading Octavia Butler, as you know, one of my favorites, when I started reading Octavia Butler, I was like, wow, this is much more complex than we're getting credit for here. These writers are getting credit for. Layers and layers of complexity that talk about not only racial dynamics, but gender dynamics, ability/disability, all of these things that are in an intersectional way, right, that really amplify the messiness of these social issues. So for me, the point of science fiction has always been to challenge us in our thinking of the normative, right? It's in many ways queer in that way, right? It starts to engage with the non-normative in ways that that compels you to rethink what you think you already know, right? It's too hard to change and kind of get outside of our boxes because we think that we know what race is. We think we understand it fully. We think we all know what we're talking about when we talk about race, racial injustice, so on and so forth. But do we really? And so, you know, for me, these narratives help us to kind of, it's that cognitive estrangement thing from Darko Suvin that we are really familiar with as we get into that kind of talking about what it is. It challenges us to think and see with fresh eyes, think things through in a fresh way, in new ways, new approaches. That which we think we already know. It unsettles us in those ways. And that's what, strangely, I love about it. It unsettles our assumptions. So for me, the point of science fiction has always been to unsettle us so that we can think newly, think freshly, and rethink our approaches to those things that we thought we already knew. And in that way, for me, it's a really hopeful genre, despite, you know, much of the dystopian kind of structures that are frequently adopted.
So I can add to that. Oh, sorry. Am I hearing my own echo or someone else? I'm sorry, I couldn't tell.
It might be your own, Betsy. I don't hear an echo.
Yeah. Well, I'll just add to all of that by saying, and I think on this score, Esther and I agree, that science fiction for us is really about unlearning as much as it is about anything else. It's about unlearning things that you feel that you already know. And unlearning requires making space for different ways of understanding and telling something, right? So what science fiction and the different worlds and the alternatives that they've always depicted is that, look, reality gets told in a number of different, a very limited set of master narratives. And we move through revolutions, and revolutions may feel very radical at the time, but they're called revolutions and not evolutions for a reason. Much of the time you end up replicating very familiar structures in one way or another, with maybe a few elements reconfigured, if you know what I mean, right? So our human history is ripe with revolutions, but we still sort of, I mean, the movement is very slow. We still end up replicating a lot of the same old structures in similar ways. But evolution is much more about ending up in a totally different space where you cannot go back to the old world, right? And the trajectory is very different. And science fiction has really always been about putting on something that looks totally different from our reality, right? So that's the unlearning part. The other thing that I love about science fiction is that, you know, Philip K. Dick, back in 1955, wrote this short essay in which he basically said that science fiction is about protest, that it's a protest medium. And science fiction is about doom, right? And to dramatize doom, to depict doom, is a form of protest because it forecasts what's going to happen if we don't course correct. So the very basis of science fiction is it's driven by the impulse, the protest impulse. And that's what I love about science fiction also.
Yeah. So one of the things that we wanted to also kind of quickly touch base on, and then we'd love to hear from some of you all, is, you know, how science fiction becomes this space of radical imagination, right? Related to race and racial issues, related to health and society, and these pandemics. That is certainly a major theme in much of science fiction. Is, you know, what do we do as human beings when we are confronted with very real existential crises of, you know, human extermination, right? And when you think about current contemporary issues such as global warming, we'll just use global warming as an example. Something that can feel like, you know, it's the consequences of it are very far away, or that's the approach that many people think. You know, science fiction can take that and kind of imagine for us. Okay, let's imagine that we're in that moment far away, right, where it's realized and we didn't do enough to stop it, right? So I'm thinking of Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, right, where she engages global warming, but not only global warming, but other intersecting issues such as increases in the disparities in wealth and access to education, and a host of other social and political views. Political ideologicalism. Okay, I just screwed up that word. You know what I mean. and extremism, right? Lack of embracing of diversity, a host of things that are happening right now in our society that if we just let them, you know, just go on as they are unchecked, what could our future look like? And what do we do then? What's the way out? What's the strategy? And so, you know, when you start to put ourselves or imagine ourselves in that space of we're already there, right? Then that requires us to think differently and inventively. And we got a little taste of that in higher education when we had to pivot so quickly. You know, in higher education, those of you who aren't professors may not know this, but it takes a long time to change the way we do things. So when suddenly we had to go to virtual modalities, not in a space of 3 or 5 years, but in the space of a week and a half, if that, a week, switch to an online modality, we were in a moment right there of, being forced to engage in radical imagining, right? And thinking radically about doing things differently, conceptualizing our work in student learning and student experience differently. And, I can't help but to think for those who are who operate in creative spaces like science fiction, like art, that that you're frequently compelled to think radically, and you're a little bit more comfortable with being uncomfortable with rapid change because you've seen some examples of it, you've read some examples of it through these texts. So for me, one of the things that we want to think about and that we'd like to think through with you is, are there any texts for you? For me, certainly Octavia Butler's Parable series is a space for radical vision, right? Where it helps us to kind of radically reimagine a host of things. Religion, how we respond to global warming, what leadership looks like and who we expect to be leaders, right? All sorts of things that are really kind of, again, they're nascent, they're already here, but we haven't been compelled to confront them head on. And I find that we're in a moment where we're being compelled to think things newly, even though maybe we aren't quite ready, but we must if we're going to survive. Betsy, do you have a text that for you presents kind of a radical vision that kind of compels you to kind of think through these times in a particular way?
Well, I try to give this some thought yesterday, and when you and I first got together to think about, well, what are some of the radically imagined futures that we think are radical in a constructive way that we could possibly pursue, but just didn't have the guts to pursue it, right? Because we're so locked in thinking about our systems and structures in the familiar, along the lines of the familiar models. For me, though, it's interesting that it's so, I found it, I was so hard pressed to find a futuristic vision that I could, fully sign on to, because much of science fiction is about critique of the present, right? And if you want to, it's almost like we haven't even done enough work to create the space to really reimagine the present, let alone the future kind of thing, right? So much of science fiction is still about just the present. Now, in terms of thinking about the present, let's take something like Parable of the Sower as an example. The other thing about science fiction, Esther has already mentioned cognitive estrangement, which is a process that many of us are familiar with. It's denaturalization, it is deconstruction, actually, in many ways, just taking apart something so that that a clock as it was built was not naturally built. It's not a natural phenomenon. Any system or structure can be taken apart and then as such changed. Okay. Now the thing is, the other element of science fiction is the novum, which is that new thing in science fiction that makes it science fiction that our present world, our reality doesn't yet have. Okay, so that's a term of art in the genre of science fiction. Now the novum, there's a novum in the Parable of the Sower series, and that is hyperempathy, which is, it's a condition, it's considered an illness, a disease in the novel, because any person, if you have it, you feel the pain of everybody else. You physically, literally, viscerally feel the pain experience, also the joy experienced by anybody who's in the same room with you. Now, the problem with this condition in the novel, as many of you know who are familiar with the novel, is that this world is racked with much more pain than joy. So people who have hyperempathy feel much more pain than they do joy. Now, in terms of thinking about our current situation, much of the work that faculty, students, and administrators at Clark and really in all institutions of education, is that everyone is trying to figure out, right? Everyone is trying to feel the pain of each other, right? And trying to see the kinds of decisions that we are making with respect to how we learn, you know, how to reopen the school, how to make sure health plans are truly, you know, solid and safe for all constituents. All of these things require being able to think from the lenses and being able to experience everyone's experiences, right, from across the board. In some ways, it would be great if we all had hyperempathy now, so that we could all feel and experience what everybody else is experiencing, and to be able to make policy based on that. I know we have a lot of public servants and politicians who really would benefit from hyperempathy. So that's one element in a novel that I think is really useful for us to think about, right? This sort of fictional novum called Hyperempathies is something truly lacking right now in many of our policymakers, right? And how do we bring about this kind of concept to encourage people to think in a more hyperempathetic way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point, Betsy. You know, will something like increased empathy, hyper empathy, be the thing that enables us to band together as communities across differences in order to survive this, right? Because the bottom line is that, and I think many of us are probably feeling this with having been in isolation, in quarantine for months now, even though some areas are opening up. There's still a way in which human beings are social creatures. We need each other literally to survive and to be well. And increasingly, I'm feeling that it's not just that we need each other kind of on a Zoom screen, but I was having a conversation with somebody earlier about how we miss the physical presence of being with other people. And there's something that happens when you are in physical presence with each other, right? That generates a kind of community and a kind of increased kind of connection that I'm concerned about the consequences of people not being able to physically be together and connect. And if there's conflict, to sit out and have a conversation in each other's presence, to be able to feel each other's energy, to be able to look directly into the eyes of someone else and just have the difficult conversations that need to happen. There's something very real about the need for human connection in a physical way that this particular moment is challenging us with. And so when we think about hyperempathy, right, as this kind of novum, like it might not be literalized as a physical manifestation of a condition, but what can we do to become more empathetic? Some people argue that reading makes you more empathetic. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But what are some other ways that we can think about care and concern for others beyond ourselves, right? And cultivate that in some very active ways. That's what science fiction, this particular text, kind of does for us, is it compels us to kind of think about this notion of empathy in new and different ways. So I guess I think we're at 12:30, and we definitely wanted this to be something of a dialogue. And so we're interested to hear from those of you who are participating. There are about 40 people here. And if you have comments that you want to make, or just stories that you want to share, ideas about spaces of radical imagination, anything that you've taken from science fiction that might be helping you get through these challenging times, you can raise your hand in the participants kind of thing. There's a hand raising mechanism, or you can send a message in the chat.
And Esther, can I add one thing? Some of you may be familiar with the 1909 short story by E.M. Forster called The Machine Stops. And that essentially, and that was written over 100 years ago, but it essentially anticipated this Zoom room culture that we are in. people are underground. They are connected only through this kind of some kind of online platform, and that's because the surface of the earth is no longer inhabitable, or at least, there's some other weirdness going on that you can check out the story for yourself. But so another question, in addition to the one that Esther just posed for all of you to participate in, is to think about how maybe a work of science fiction, it doesn't matter whatever it is helping you maybe understand better our current conditions with the intersecting dynamics of the pandemic and also the social justice movements that are going on right now, right? And how any work along those lines is helping you think through it, perhaps even getting you through it.
It's a quiet group.
And if that sounds like we're asking you to do some analysis that you're not ready for, or fun origin stories, cool origin stories are also really, really great.
Yeah.
So I was just going to type it, but if there's just silence, I'll just do it.
Go for it, Mila.
And I feel a little redundant here also bringing up Butler, but I can't help myself. I just feel like in this time, dawn keeps coming back to me. And just first, I mean, you just brought up social distancing. Are we avoiding spoilers? Is this a thing? Because I'm bad at that. But just
to say that, look, it's an occupational hazard to be in a literature class of any kind. Know the ending.
Yeah.
It does not take away the necessity of finding out everything that led up to that ending by reading the book nonetheless. Okay, thank you. Sorry, Mila.
Oh yeah, no, you're fine. Great. But yeah, I mean, just not being able to touch each other and
yes, that's right.
Yeah. And but also just thinking through the process of those characters and like getting over it, and who gets over it the last, it's the men. And and then of course thinking about gender binaries. And I think that there's a lot in that book about resistance of accepting others, that ties right into race just as much as gender. And I don't know, I think in so many ways, at least the way I've been interpreting the world, that book's just having a moment for me. And I suppose in a therapeutic way, just knowing that like, oh, well, they got over it. They made a new thing. They handled it. Everything's fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if nothing else for me, science fiction just poses really great questions. It's like, okay, so how, that actual literal thing may not be happening. And for some people, the lack of literalism is disconcerting and they don't like it. And, or correlation to reality, right? Our contemporary is problematic and therefore they don't see any utility in it. But for me and many others, many of you, that's not the point. The point is the questions that the literature raises. What are the questions that are being raised? What does it mean for us to not be able to connect in a physical way together? What does that mean? What does that mean for our health, mental, physical, otherwise? What does that mean for our capacity to have empathy, right? What does that mean for what our future looks like going forward in so many social contexts, right? So many contexts that are being laid bare now of how much we actually rely on togetherness, right, for all aspects of our life. So if we can't have that, right, what Dawn does is it says, okay, how are we going to do it newly? How are we going to be creative? How are we going to be agile and respond in a new way? Just because this is the way that we've always done it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to do it that way in order to, so what can we do, right? What's at the crux of what's wrong with this picture, right? What's truly at the crux of our concerns and our angst, and really some of the really wild behavior we're seeing with people who don't want to engage in the safety measures that are for others as much as they are for themselves? What's at the crux of that? Is it really about freedom? Because there's freedom to and there's freedom from. There are all sorts of different sorts of freedoms that we need to be talking about. And then so there are ways in which it actually enables us to kind of question freedom, what we understand freedom to be, who we think deserves it, what does it mean to deserve freedom and to have rights, and all of these things that ostensibly should not be politicized, but have ended up being politicized in some strange ways. So I see Matthew Pettengill's hand up.
Sorry, I was looking for my unmute button there. I'm just very interested lately with the world going on, in what I found myself drifting towards, in that it's not, I don't want to take us too off topic from science fiction because it's sort of adjacent, but I find myself right now in this moment drawn to like post-apocalyptic narratives, and which aren't really sci-fi in the way, but I think they're speculative in some ways. In particular, I read it a while back, but I've been thinking a lot about a novel called Station 11, which is sort of it's about a lot of things, but in particular, the thought of arts persisting when our societal kind of world has ceased to exist. So this is probably a little bit of a stray from what you guys were just talking about, but when you were asking about what we're participating in this world, that's sort of how I'm finding myself enjoying speculative or science fiction, is dealing with stripping away our world like we know it right now, this sort of technological thing, and thinking more about smaller communities. And I don't know, that's just where I'm drifting in this particular world, which may be different than others to be reading about the apocalypse while we're in the middle of a global pandemic. But
Well, I think that's the whole point about post-apocalyptic narratives. We right now in our moment in the middle of this pandemic, we want to say that, oh, now the dystopian has finally become reality. But that is not really true. There's a concept called slow violence, where a lot of this stuff has been happening for a very long time. We were dystopian before COVID-19 already in many respects. And it's just usually, there's something cataclysmic that gets dropped in the story that accelerates everything. Okay, so if we think about our reality as a story, as a narrative, and the implantment of it, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's already, a lot of elements that are being put in place already through this process of slow violence before something cataclysmic that happens that sort of, is the last straw, as it were, right? And then really exposes everything, in a kind of hyper objective way that previously we've only had little pieces of. Mm-hmm. And also, pre-COVID, you might say that the novum in a post-apocalyptic work of fiction is the dystopian vision, the post-apocalyptic scenario. That's the novum because it's the thing that is not in our reality. Mm-hmm. Now we can't really call it a novum anymore because it truly is real. Mm-hmm. So if you're talking about a plague narrative, like Atwood or like Station 11, previously it was sci-fi. Now it's just plain old reality kind of thing, right? Yeah. And what's difficult about, being a consumer or reader of post-apocalyptic or dystopian fiction is that, for a very long time, those of us who read it and those of us who teach it feel like we're teaching it and reading it in order to avert what is happening right now. And there's a sense, I was just telling another group this, that I've been feeling kind of depressed, like all these years of doing this work, of teaching this body of literature to prevent what's happening now didn't work. Maybe dystopian fiction doesn't work. Maybe it just doesn't teach what it teaches. Maybe it's all useless. And I had to get myself over that, right? To come back to believing that there is important work that is still being done by the genre.
Yeah, for sure. And to one of your earlier points, Betsy, about the fact that in many ways the apocalyptic experience that we're all going through right now on a national global level for many communities, I just want to point out, we were already there, right? Communities of color, Latinx, trans communities, Black communities, Indigenous communities, right? So there's a saying in the African American community that when America catches a cold, African America gets pneumonia, right? I mean, African Americans have already been struggling, right? And then when suddenly it's bad for everybody, it's just amplified 10 times worse. And you could say that for a number of historically marginalized groups in the nation. So, you know, we were already there, but nobody really cared because it didn't impact them personally, right? They couldn't see it for themselves. It goes back to that empathy thing. They weren't experiencing it, and you know what? Maybe it's your fault that your community is struggling. So figure it out, just work harder. And situations like this, a pandemic narrative, a pandemic experience levels it. It shows us all how vulnerable we really are, how fragile our systems actually are. We can see how very quickly the economy and all sorts of people have just been devastated. Meanwhile, the very, very, very wealthy rich, very wealthy and rich have just gotten richer, according to an NPR radio. So, I mean, we were always there, but we weren't able to recognize it because of who was suffering, right? And our inability to empathize with those particular groups. And now that that experience is kind of flattened and everybody, the vast majority of people are going through it. Now it's a question of, we've got to do something about this because this sucks. Well, yes, it does, and it always did. Thank you for noticing. So let's see. Jared had his hand raised, and then Emma had her hand raised, and then Juan Pablo.
Hi. So, I mean, I come to science fiction through popular culture. I mean, mostly through films, but it has a lot to do with the art side of images of science fiction, and I'm very interested in how those images kind of manufacture consent or play into different narratives ideologically, and how we can use that radically. And I've been part of this. I was part of a few of these workshops that were organized by the Guild of Future Architects. Did you hear about those? Well, it was a writer's room, like a writing group, where we would look at different decades in the past, find, you know, sort of different moments that were significant, switch the narrative, and then think about how that would change our present and how it would change our future in, you know, in terms of character development, and then like having that be kind of like a crowbar that opened up our imagination and dislodged us from the bigger science fiction, which is like white, heteropatriarchal, colonial, you know, the fiction that we exist in every single day. So I understood, you know, the value of radical imagining speculative fiction in dislodging this sort of conveyor belt that we're on. But one of the things that I noticed, and this is kind of an observation, it's not a big sort of statement or question, was that there was a big rift in each of the workshops between those who were like really letting themselves go and believing in this, in the value of fiction and in the value of imagining radically, and then another group, and maybe even sometimes in the same person, who were in conflict with that idea, who were like, okay, it's really great to imagine all this stuff, but right now people are dying. Like, this is a huge privilege, and I'm like, people of color across the board, people from you know, oppressed positions, we're all, you know, caught between two worlds, and I also am caught between these two worlds. And something that Betsy, you had just mentioned about feeling disheartened, you know, with what you were teaching, and then like history is repeating itself. I've also been feeling the same thing. That's what teachers were telling me when I was growing up in high school. You know, they're like, we have to learn history so we don't repeat it. But we know history and we know what to do, and yet it's still repeating itself. So maybe, I don't know how to form it as a question. I'd love to just hear your thoughts on some of these maybe contradictions or some of these parallel streams that are moving between speculative radical fiction and reimagining and sort of the pragmatics of the day.
That's
Go
a
ahead.
great question. Yeah. I'm sorry, Esther. It looked like you wanted to say something. By all means, do.
Well, no, I was just going to say to your point, Jared, that this is a kind of an ongoing tension of those between those who don't see the utility or the value in imagining, right, in radical imagining at that, when they want to be kind of engaged in the immediacy of fixing immediate problems, right? And I personally don't think that the two are necessarily in conflict with each other. But there's certainly a perception that there is a conflict between, okay, be reasonable. Let's be realistic. You know, we've got these very real issues right now. So why bother about the future? Well, if you don't know where you're going, right? If you don't have an idea of where you want to be, that looks different from, you know, the history that we've already lived that has not been workable, then you precisely run the risk. You need to be able to do both and, right? And that's kind of the central tension of trying to bring those two sides together, if indeed they are two sides. You know, that they are part of the same issue, right? And they need to be thought jointly. They need to be thought together, because what you do now, right, these upstream decisions have consequences downstream, right? They have consequences in the future. So we can't afford not to think about what kind of future our now decisions are creating, right? That's the reality for anything. It's the reality with global warming. It's the reality with our decisions about our health systems and structures and how we're going about thinking about vaccinations, all of these things that we're trying to figure out that we're really making up as we go along in many ways. If you're making it up as you go along, you might as well think about the future and try to create a better future with the decisions that you make now. So that tension, I think, is something that continuously needs to be kind of undone. That it's a stark binary. You have to think both together simultaneously, in my opinion.
It also matters who's at the table for reimagining this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
And people have very different lenses about what they can abandon and recreate and create, and what they cannot.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are, again, some really deeply entrenched ways of thinking about social structure that a lot of people are frankly unprepared to take on. You know, there's the saying that it's easy to think about the end of the world in a lot of this fiction, but it's really hard to think about the end of capitalism. Because, I mean, think about it. It's just, people can imagine all kinds of end of the world scenarios, but people can't imagine themselves out of capitalistic practices. And so so we have to look at some really coercive master narratives and master scripts that are still in some ways informing the way that we craft radical futures, because some of it is actually not that radical and not that new.
Exactly. So let's see, Emma, you had your hand up.
Going. Thanks for holding this. I wanted to respond to Betsy's question from a couple questions ago about whether speculative fiction is working in the sense of like manifesting action that we're hoping for it to manifest. And I've been really thinking about this a lot. So I read this article that kind of said that when you read a dystopian work, there's kind of this catharsis that happens in the reader. And sometimes it almost takes on the same feeling that taking an activist action would provide for you, like almost like a pleasure in reading something apocalyptic. And so I feel like there's this duality happening where when you read this speculative science fiction, you're almost considering more realities and asking those important questions, but maybe also having a catharsis that can almost make you feel like you did the action by reading the text and like, all right, we did our action. Let's wrap it up there. All right. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Emma. Yeah, I mean, there are a number of studies, I think, on kind of the effects of reading and the effects of reading particular types of literature as well. What I'm interested in is, and we haven't talked as much about other modalities of science fiction, such as movies and TV shows, which I think are equally as important to kind of think about how they shape our engagement and understandings of contemporary issues as well as the future. But for sure, there's something that happens, right, in the cognitive space. And I'd love for a psychologist or to work with a psychologist to kind of do more research on what different modes of engagement with science fiction in particular does for the mind, the psyche, and so forth. I wrote a short article that I wrote, good science fiction, quality science fiction is actually good for your health because it helps you to have a little bit more mental agility during times such as this, right? And, it was backed up with some stuff, but I don't know that I can make the same claim for gaming, for example. I haven't found any literature on that. And so, but it's interesting. It's a different way of cognitively engaging with speculative worlds. So let's go to Juan Pablo.
Hi, colleagues. Thank you so much for organizing this. So my question is a little bit tangential, but still related, and it is about horror as a genre and where the line between horror and sci-fi might be. And I ask this because I've been reading some of the top Latin American writers right now are women in their 30s and 40s who are writing horror. Some of it is overtly political, some of it not. And it is like horrific horror about dismemberment and child abuse, just terrible, terrible stuff. So I wonder what the consensus is or what your thoughts are about that line between sci-fi and horror, if there is one. Because to the authors themselves, there doesn't seem to be, but I wonder what you thought.
Yeah,
well,
Betsy, did you? Yeah.
Yeah, that is really fascinating. And there's been a lot of discussions about horror as a genre that, body horror to even be more specific, right? It is about trauma to the body like severe trauma to the body, physically or mentally and psychologically. But in terms of dismemberment and stuff, and this is about, to what extent you'd like to take the metaphoric, dimensions, how far you'd like to take that. I think women writers in particular, right? And non-cis writers and people, writers who are very, very attentive to issues of gender and how your gender identity makes you, brings perhaps greater vulnerabilities and precarities, right? In terms of how your body gets harmed. So there's the attention there. But dismemberment, is very much a part of thinking about how the body or the body politic is ruptured or breached, how the boundaries are breached. It's all about the horror of the inside exposes the outside, as Kristeva has said, and it's about all the neat boundaries that people rely on, ruptured or breached, right? That's what body horror is about. It's about invasions and invasiveness. It's about rape culture, right? So these are all dimensions of that kind of horror. And they literalize it by depicting the trauma to the body, right? Visually on screen and also in literature by depicting things like dismemberment and rape and child abuse and things like that, right? So, but it's really ultimately a critique about boundaries. Mm-hmm. Right, and about who invades them and how do you preserve them and who has autonomy or who has the ability or capacity, right, to keep, well, to basically have control over one's body, whether it is the social body or if it's the personal body. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And from kind of the generic distinction standpoint, right, the reason that I like to use speculative fiction as a term as opposed to science fiction in kind of popular culture is more recognizable than speculative, but I like speculative because it does encompass what I call these loosely related but not necessarily always cleanly aligned genres such as horror, fantasy, science fiction, in any of kind of what Samuel Delady calls the paraliterary, right? So there are ways in which they're kind of loosely related, a set of family resemblances. There's a great text that I've used called Speculations on Speculation, which kind of brings together, it's an anthology of different theories of science fiction, right? Of what is speculative fiction. And it's an ongoing debate about how you parse what's what. How do you identify which genre is which genre? And, for me, I use speculation because the beauty of these related genres is that there's a lot of slippage and it's messy, just like all of the things that they're dealing with. We don't need the clean, in my opinion, kind of separation between generic boundaries in the term speculative fiction, because it's just, they tend to borrow quite a bit from each other. That slippage is actually quite useful in many ways when it's done intentionally. I would love to hear about the authors that you're reading, Juan Pablo, and read some of them, because I'd be interested to see what they're doing in the horror dimension.
Yeah. The great science fiction film Alien is very much about body horror, right? And it is science fiction. I mean, and so it's the interesting link between the bodies of the people on board and the creatures, and also the spaceship. But anyway.
Okay, Emily Huang.
Sorry, having a hard time unmuting. So a quick introduction. I'm Betsy's cousin, and I don't know if you remember this, Betsy. You were the one that gave me The Hobbit when I was 8. And thus set me on a journey to learning more about sci-fi, and this is you influencing even as a child, moving forward. Well, with that said, instead of the creative route, I did go the science route, and I'm a physician now, entering the horrors of the hospital daily, and having a cleaning routine every time I come home as to not infect my family. I am choosing to view this pandemic as a catalyst for more people to reflect on social injustices, and as a way to move forward from where we are, because there is a lot of work to do. And I'm continuing with my sci-fi reading more as an escape as opposed to an educational lesson, which I should start thinking about it more as a way to escape, the injustices of the world. Thank you for holding this discussion. I appreciate you.
Thanks for not dishing any family secrets.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you for that, Emily. And absolutely, there's something to be said for escapism too. I mean, I think, with the 24/7, 365 news cycle, it's just exhausting to be hyper engaged all the time with all that's going on. It's a lot for anybody. And so, absolutely, escapism is healthy too in many instances. So we're getting close to our time. But I do want the last couple of hands that are up to be acknowledged, and to have the opportunity to share their thoughts. Luke, and then Jen Lee, and we will, and those will be the last two comments or questions.
So I know earlier we mentioned like different modalities of science fiction, and one work specifically that I've been coming back to a lot is a video game, Fallout New Vegas, which is very much about radical imaginings. It's, it's set in and around Las Vegas 200 years after worldwide nuclear war, and the player explores ideologies that have arisen and determines or has a part in determining the ideological future of this region. And most of the dominant ideologies are clinging to the past. You have people trying to replicate pre-war America. You have people trying to replicate ancient Rome. You have a pre-war industrialist who kept himself alive for these 200 years and wants to create a libertarian utopia with himself as a dictator. And like, you can side with any of these people, or you can be like, what about something new? And it's also like science fiction that's not just about technology. It has a lot of exploration of different cultural identities and tribal identities that have arisen, and even ones that have continued. It explores how this guy trying to create a new Roman Empire, he's doing it by conquering and assimilating tribes. And the first tribe he conquered was a real-life Native American tribe, the Blackfoots. Another, in the game, it's a self-described tribe that has continued, is the Mormon Church, which it offers mutual protection with other tribal identities at the cost of forced conversion. And it's this massive project of exploring just so many different ways for people to organize themselves when the slate has been practically wiped clean.
Luke, if I may respond very quickly, I mean, that's a classic case of the fact that, when you have an apocalyptic moment, right, in a fictional work, as it were, it does present itself as an opportunity for building something new. And in almost all the cases, the old reflexes kick in, and the various sort of tribes, if you will, right, want their version of utopia to be the new world or the new order, right? So some of you may be familiar with Colson Whitehead's Zone 1, which is an incredible novel, and it's very much about the fact that in this moment, really what is getting set up and reconstructed is the old social order, the old political order. And Emily Buza, did you want to respond to that? Because I saw your hand go up a little bit. No? Okay.
No, there's just stuff happening in our kitchen, sorry.
All right. So yeah, but that's really interesting, Luke. Could you put in the chat the name of that game so that we have it?
Thanks, Luke. So we'll look for that in the chat. Oh, great. There it is. Fallout New Vegas. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's Jen Lee. You'll have the final comment / question.
I actually have response brief response to Jared and Juan Pablo. So earlier, Jared mentioned that we learned history, but we repeat it, and it's kind of frustrating. And I completely agree with him. And also from the perspective of trauma studies, history is, as you know, inherently traumatic, and because of that there are stories and narratives of the oppressed and the subaltern that have not been included in official history. So I guess our job as literature teacher is to keep talking, keep teaching, and keep imagining, practice radical imagining, so that we can help ourselves and others to represent and imagine what has not been representable. And also, Juan Pablo talked about horror and sci-fi, and I really appreciate his question, because I'm working on an article, and I was thinking about slow violence and horror and how they work together to represent something that otherwise can be talked about or even imagined. So I really appreciate his question.
Thank you so much for that, Jin Lee. Yeah, I'm feeling ever more hopeful, even after this especially after this conversation, because precisely, I mean, many of you are alumni, and I don't know what path that your careers have taken you into, but I do hope, I think we both hope that wherever you are, you can engage in spaces of radical imagining, engage in radical imagining that can help us to take to heart that these are challenging times, but they also present an opportunity, and that's the hope I think that science fiction offers. You know, nothing is completely ever totally over. There's opportunity in the newness of the moment that we're experiencing, and in the challenges that we're experiencing, and we have an opportunity to think radically, think newly, and keep trying to move forward to create a better version of what we're currently experiencing and what we've historically experienced. So Betsy and I thank you for joining. This has been a great opportunity. If you don't know, we're both administrators now. We don't really get that much of a chance lately in our current roles to really talk about this passion, why we got into this industry of higher education. So thank you, Betsy, for agreeing, I know how busy you are as Dean of the College, for joining me for this hour. Thank you all for taking an hour out of your days on your lunch break, nevertheless, if you're on the East Coast. And we really wish you health and peace and bright futures.
Thanks, everybody, for coming.